The conflict between Iran and the United States did not begin with missiles or nuclear threats. It began with mistrust, power, and oil. To understand why these two nations remain bitter adversaries today, we must travel back to 1953. At that time, Iran was led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who made a bold decision. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, which had been largely controlled by British interests. This move angered Western powers, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. In response, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a covert operation known as Operation Ajax, which removed Mossadegh from power and strengthened the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Though the Shah became a strong ally of Washington, many Iranians never forgot the foreign interference in their democracy. This moment planted the seeds of resentment that would grow for decades. For the next 25 years, the United States supported the Shah's regime politically, financially, and militarily. The Shah pushed rapid modernization and westernization, but his rule was also marked by repression. His secret police, Savak, were notorious for crushing opposition. While some Iranians benefited from economic development, others saw widening inequality and the erosion of cultural and religious values. Among the critics was a religious leader named Ruhollah Khomeini, who would later become the face of revolution. In 1979, everything changed. Massive protests erupted across Iran, uniting students, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens against the Shah. Eventually, the Shah fled the country, and the Islamic Revolution transformed Iran into an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The United States lost one of its closest Middle Eastern allies almost overnight. But the breaking point came later that year, when Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. The crisis lasted 444 days and became one of the most humiliating foreign policy crises in American history. Diplomatic relations were severed, sanctions were imposed, and the hostility between the two countries became official. During the 1980s, tensions deepened amid the devastating Iran-Iraq War. The United States backed Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein, providing intelligence and support, while Iran viewed America as complicit in the bloodshed. In 1988, a tragic incident further inflamed anger when the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 civilians. The U.S. claimed it was a mistake during a tense naval confrontation, but in Iran, the event reinforced the belief that America was an aggressor. The rivalry evolved in the decades that followed. Rather than direct war, both nations engaged in indirect confrontation. Iran expanded its regional influence, supporting groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and backing allies in Syria and Iraq. The United States accused Iran of sponsoring terrorism and destabilizing the region. Meanwhile, economic sanctions became a central tool of American policy, severely restricting Iran's access to global markets and banking systems. In the early 2000s, after the September 11th attacks, tensions took another dramatic turn. Although Iran initially condemned the attacks and quietly cooperated against the Taliban in Afghanistan, U.S. President George W. Bush later labeled Iran part of the Axis of Evil, grouping it with Iraq and North Korea. Suspicion hardened. Attention shifted toward Iran's nuclear program, which Western governments feared could lead to the development of nuclear weapons. Iran insisted its program was for peaceful energy purposes, but mistrust ran deep. Years of negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic maneuvering culminated in 2015 with the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The deal was a landmark agreement between Iran and world powers, including the United States, aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. For a brief moment, it seemed like decades of hostility might soften. Businesses prepared to re-enter Iranian markets, and hopes rose for cautious reconciliation. However, the agreement's future became uncertain in 2018 when U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew from the deal, arguing it was flawed and did not address Iran's regional activities or missile program. the U.S. reinstated severe sanctions under a maximum pressure campaign. Iran responded by gradually expanding its nuclear activities beyond the limits set by the agreement. The fragile bridge built by diplomacy began to crumble. Tensions reached a boiling point in January 2020. A U.S. drone strike near Baghdad International Airport killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, one of the most powerful military figures in Iran and the commander of the Quds force. The assassination shocked the world. Iran retaliated with missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, and for days, many feared a full-scale war was imminent. Though open war was avoided, the event marked one of the most dangerous escalations in decades. Beyond military actions, the conflict also plays out economically and strategically. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes, has become a flashpoint. Any confrontation there has global consequences, affecting oil prices and international markets. Cyber warfare has also emerged as a new battlefield, with both nations accused of launching digital attacks against each other's infrastructure. Yet despite decades of hostility, back-channel diplomacy has never completely disappeared. Negotiations have resumed at various times, often indirectly through European or regional mediators. Both sides understand the enormous cost of full-scale war. The Iranian government faces economic strain under sanctions, while the United States must balance its Middle East strategy with global priorities in Asia and Europe. The conflict today is a mixture of ideological rivalry, regional power competition, and geopolitical calculation. At its core, the Iran-USA conflict is not just about nuclear weapons or military strikes. It is about history. About a coup in 1953 that shaped Iranian perceptions of American interference. About a revolution in 1979 that reshaped the Middle East. And about decades of mutual suspicion hardened by crises and missed opportunities. For many Iranians, America represents foreign intervention and economic pressure. For many Americans, Iran symbolizes hostility and instability in a volatile region. The future of this rivalry remains uncertain. It could move toward renewed diplomacy, especially if both sides find incentives for compromise. Or it could escalate through miscalculation, proxy conflicts, or regional crises. What is certain is that the relationship between Iran and the United States continues to influence global energy markets, Middle Eastern politics, and international security. 70 years after Operation Ajax, the shadow of history still looms large. Two nations, once strategic partners, now stand locked in a complex standoff, not in a declared war, but in a continuous struggle of influence, power, and principle. And as the world watches, the question remains: will diplomacy finally overcome decades of distrust? Or will history continue to repeat itself? Over the decades, the two nations have clashed indirectly through proxy wars, accusations of terror support, and competition for influence across the Middle East. The early 2000s and 2010s saw increasing tensions over Iran's nuclear ambitions, briefly eased by the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, only for the U.S. withdrawal in 2018 under President Trump to reignite sanctions and distrust. Recently, the conflict has manifested in military escalations, economic pressure, and repeated diplomatic efforts. The U.S. has deployed major naval forces to the region and issued warnings for commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic choke point for global oil, while Iran has amplified its nuclear activities and broader regional influence. Despite these tensions, both sides continue to engage in negotiations, indirect talks mediated by Oman and held in places like Geneva, seeking a diplomatic path forward that could ease sanctions in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. Whether this standoff evolves into reconciliation or further confrontation will depend on complex geopolitical calculations, regional alliances, and the balance between power and diplomacy on the world stage.